something going on. The government, the Air Force, they send out what's known as chaff, and it's a way to experiment with the radar system. And when you see this kind of a pattern like this, you can rest assured there's something going on.
Northern California, we've got a bit of an unusual situation. Now, this first portion of the radar cycle, fairly bland and typical, but then you see these bands of very distinct cloud cover moving into the region. That is not rain, that is not snow, believe it or not. Military aircraft flying through the region, dropping chaff. Small bits of aluminum, sometimes it's made of plastic, or even metallicized paper products, but it's used as an anti-radar issue, and obviously they're up there practicing. Now, they won't confirm that, but I was in the Marine Corps for many years, and I'll tell you right now, that's what it is.
This is kind of unique. Last time we saw this on the radar was last winter. Remember, we were talking about military chaff? Basically, it's the Canadian military doing some exercises, airplane exercises out here. And what they're doing is they're dropping chaff, which is basically like a mylar material that's expected to fool missiles. So it's just a military exercise, but it's interesting to see that chaff show up on the radar.
My name is Steve Rowley. I'm the Science and Operations Officer at the National Weather Service in Charleston, South Carolina. Merriam-Webster has a nice definition of chaff, and we're talking about materials such as strips of foil or clusters of flying wires that's being dropped from aircraft. Real clear signal that these are non-precipitation echoes. In fact, this is chaff. This is the small metallic objects that are being dropped from aircraft.
Controlling the weather has been an aspiration of the United States since the mid-1900s, as evidenced by this report from 1966. By this point, these weather modification programs had already been active for 10 years, which detailed seeding operations for various objectives. Seeding refers to dispersed chemical agents typically from aircraft, otherwise known as chemtrails. Specific mentions to modify lake storms, prevent rain, and suppress hail, all to be achieved by chemical dispersion. Then came the National Weather Modification Act of 1976, where Congress increased the budget for weather programs and reiterated many of the same objectives from 1966. It wasn't long before the government realized military applications of weather modification and decided to weaponize it during the Vietnam War. Aerosols were used to induce rain for weeks on end in what became known as Project Popeye. Realizing the capacity for this striking abuse of power, the United Nations signed a treaty known as NMOD, which essentially bans weather warfare. Interestingly, the treaty doesn't prevent a nation experimenting with weather modification on their own soil. There exist chemical mixtures to induce rain and others to absorb and reduce it, such as this powder made by Dynamat, which claims that dropping 4 tons of the stuff on a developing storm completely eliminated it on radar. As impressive as that is, chemical aerosols would become only half of the equation in modern weather modification technology.
And now we're learning that scientists and researchers are looking at how to change the weather on purpose. That's right. Lasers now could one day manipulate rain and lightning. CBS This Morning contributor Michio Kaku is a physics professor at City College. I mean, lasers, really? To change the weather?
That's right. Well, as Mark Twain once famously said, everyone complains about the weather, but no one ever does anything about it. Well, instead of doing a rain dance, we physicists are firing trillion-watt lasers into the sky to actually precipitate rain clouds and actually bring down lightning bolts. This is potentially a game changer.
In the mid-1990s, the Air Force produced this document, Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025. The document claims that current 1990s technology will mature over the next 30 years and that these outcomes will be achievable for any country with the resources, creating floods, enhance storms, induce drought, remove clouds, improve or disrupt communications, and generate fog. On the concept page, it's stated that these objectives can be accomplished by infusing either energy or chemicals into the meteorological process. Just to be clear, infusing chemicals into the meteorological process is most commonly accomplished by aerosol dispersions from aircraft. Some people call these chemtrails. Another objective is modifying the ionosphere to better control and enhance over-the-horizon communications and radar by injection of chemical vapors and heating with electromagnetic radiation. This graphic shows the artificial mirrors created by chemicals and electromagnetic energy, which communications and radar would bounce off of in a predictable trajectory to the receiver station on the ground. This all may sound like science fiction, but coincidentally enough, the Air Force was building a high-powered antenna array capable of producing exactly the type of electromagnetic radiation discussed in this document.
HAARP stands for the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program.
The federal government spent about $300 million. It's the most exquisite of its kind in the world. It's currently owned and operated by the Air Force Research Lab.
About the ionosphere, particularly for radio communication, is that radio waves, when traveling through free space, behave differently when they travel through a region of charged particles or plasma. The ionosphere is basically a partially ionized plasma, and so one of the things that can happen to radio waves that travel through a plasma is that they can be bent, their polarization can change, they can be absorbed. And since so much of our lives is really dependent on radio communication, either communicating to satellites or for navigation with GPS, which is also communicating with satellites essentially, or over-the-horizon communication or over-the-horizon radar, it's really important for us to understand how radio waves are affected by the ionosphere, and in some cases how radio waves affect the ionosphere in the case of HAARP or other powerful radio transmitters.
The intentions to alter weather and communications by the Air Force become a reality with the famous Bernard Eastland patent. These objectives are echoed in the explicit language of the patent, specifying the ability to modify communications by means of a plume of altered plasma. This is akin to the ionospheric mirrors mentioned earlier. Other purposes is open to interpretation, but I would attest that it most certainly refers to weather modification effects. The HAARP system is more than likely based completely off the Eastland patent, further evidenced by the suggested location of Alaska. Alaska was sought because it's positioned geographically to magnetic latitudes and sits atop of plentiful fuel sources like natural gas to operate on. Objections to the HAARP system and the use of directed energy weapons are plenty.
They are designed to be truly large generating stations, which here in California, of course, we're very sensitive to the need for some new power approaches. But the amount needed for the thunderstorm modification is smaller than the amount planned for these facilities.
And when you hear about plans with orbiting satellites and microwave downlinks to transfer energy, you immediately think of the Department of Defense being involved here some way, because it sounds like a wonderful thing for military strategists. Does this have any roots in DoD planning at all, or research, or money?
Well, my original work on this general area was funded actually by the Defense Department.
Irrespective of any dangers associated with the beam, and we can debate that endlessly, I think there are probably two fairly important problems that I see. One of them is that tornadoes form very rapidly, and there are a number of very practical problems associated with identifying which storms you're going to subject this to. And I think even if it did prove to be practical, in some sense, to modify storms and prevent tornadoes in the way Mr. Eastland is describing, there are still yet a number of very large practical hurdles to overcome, not the least of which is the multi-billion-dollar cost of the satellites necessary to make this happen. Furthermore, recent research in tornado genesis suggests that, in fact, warming the downdraft may have exactly the opposite effect desired. There are some indications from recent work done in the field and in various field projects associated with the so-called Vortex project that suggests that, in fact, warm downdrafts are the ones that are most likely to produce tornadoes. So Mr. Eastland's proposed fix might, in fact, make tornadoes longer and more violent.
The European Parliament voiced its concerns as it properly referenced HAARP as a weapons system which disrupts the climate, as well as a serious threat to the environment with an incalculable impact on human life. Most eerily, they called for a ban on chemical, electrical, or sound vibration weaponry, which could alter and manipulate the human brain. It's no wonder the US ignored the European request to send a representative to discuss HAARP. They had already placed the program under national security and were no longer legally required to be truthful with them or their own citizens.
So-called stratospheric aerosol injection. This might, for example, involve large numbers of aircraft scattering large quantities of particles, such as sulfur dioxide, into one specific layer of the atmosphere, namely the stratosphere. The particles would then act as a reflective filter, throwing a percentage of solar radiation back into space, and thereby preventing it from heating up the atmosphere in the first place. The objective is thus to artificially cool down the global climate. But what would be the effects on our planet of such a large-scale technological experiment? These could be devastating.
Stratospheric aerosol injection has been proposed to mitigate global warming. The patents for these reflective metallic aerosols have existed for over a decade. Other patents exist as jet fuel additives to create aerosols for the stated purpose of cloud modification and weather control. Simple observation seems to show two phenomena in the sky: quickly dissipating condensation trails and thick white dispersions that linger for hours. Thus far, we've seen government documents reveal finances and plans to modify weather. We've seen historical examples like Project Popeye, where there was success in modifying weather. We saw an international treaty that bans weather warfare. We've seen multiple patents detailing chemical and energetic means to alter weather. We examined the European parliamentary document expressing its concerns about HAARP and its exotic weapons capability. And finally, we saw the recent concepts of stratospheric aerosol injection to infuse the atmosphere with reflective material to cool the planet. Many people insist that covert military spray operations have already been deployed. If that was true, shouldn't we find physical evidence these operations leave behind?
The way I get most of my data, in fact I should say the preponderance, 90% of it, there's a little bit from natural observation, but 90% of it comes from testing snow water and rainwater. And I get it as soon as possible after it falls. And it varies also a little bit on whether you get it right in the first wave of precipitation that comes over for a front, and there's always more in the first wave than in the end of a front when it's coming through. It's a 5-day storm. It's always a lot more on day 1 than there is on day 5.
A lot more contamination.
Yeah, a lot more contamination.
Okay.
Like in a first wave that came through one time here, we measured the snow, and the snow was 61,000 parts per billion, that's micrograms per liter, of aluminum. Now, that makes your hair stand on end when it's that much.
Put that into context for us, that how high above what we should expect is that, and we know that we should probably be less than 1 ppb, we're 61,000. Put that into context if you would.
Okay, normal is 0. And you're getting 61,000. Normal would be 0. Or maybe to allow for, say, some people will say it's contaminated. Well, a contamination rate would be like 1 part per billion, which is a heck of a lot different from 61,000 parts per billion. Even the soil is not that high. There's more aluminum in the precipitation coming down than there is in the soil.
Would you not, we would have to consider that highly toxic snow and rain as far as human consumption.
The federal government has a toxic limit of 50 parts per billion or micrograms per liter of aluminum. And we're talking, 50 is the limit for federal. And we're talking local people that are drinking rainwater that's doing thousands. But when it starts going into the thousands, like we're getting in rain and snow water now, and I'm not talking just Mount Shasta, I'm talking all over the United States, you're getting in the thousands.
Of parts per billion.
Of parts per billion, micrograms per liter.
Reminding people that.
It's just astounding.
One is that we used a Learjet. It's a pressurized cabin for one thing. We can get to higher altitudes. It's much quicker. And we used instrumentation that was appropriate for smaller particulates. We had instruments to monitor the air quality in real time. We had 2 particle meters on board, one that measured PM 2.5, so that would be relatively large particles that we're normally concerned about, these respirable particles that get into our lungs. But we also had on board a particle meter that went down to 20 nanometers. So that meter, combined with the larger particle meter, gave us a full assessment of materials ranging from 20 nanometers up to 2.5 microns. Our filters that we use were 0.1 micron, so that's 100 nanometer pore size. That would capture many more of the nanomaterials that were being released. What we're breathing in pressurized cabins is actually air from the outside. It's being taken in front of the engines. Some of the airstream goes into the engine to feed the combustion process, and then bleed air then off of that is taken directly from the outside, pressurized, and then is used to pressurize the cabin. And we could sample it right from the vents. So we had a sampling wand that we could hold up to the vent, and the sampling wand was sampling for the ultrafine particles. We sampled through one of these confluent layers. And as we passed through that layer, the larger particle meter basically read just ambient air within the cabin. With regard to the nanoparticle meter, there was clear evidence that there were smaller particles at significant numbers present within that layer. We conducted the analyses of these nanomaterials and conclusively confirmed that there were aluminum oxide, barium sulfate nanoparticles in the samples that we took on the East Coast on that second flight. For my mind, that would be sufficient, but I'm also was quite interested in, well, what's going on the West Coast? Are these similar types of results can be collected in various regions?
Other patents for stratospheric aerosols name the exact compounds being found in the air and the rainwater, in this case aluminum oxide, strengthening the likelihood that clandestine spray operations are already underway.
We've had some incredibly unique footage sent to us. This footage should be an excellent tool for those that are trying to wake others up to the climate engineering programs. This is a tanker. It appears to be an Airbus A340-200. Look in the center, between the wing plumes, you'll see a secondary disbursement coming out of this aircraft. This is what is so unique to this film. Even though we have spray already emitting from the wings, we have a secondary disbursement, very visible here, between the plumes of the aircraft. Now, this footage should be an excellent tool to use for waking others up that are not yet aware of these programs.
Looking up at the sky can look wildly different from day to day. On the right is a bright blue sky with natural cumulus clouds, and on the left we see thick, slowly dispersing plumes which have turned the sky white. It's interesting that Science Daily and Scientific American both warn that geoengineering attempts could turn the skies white. To spoon-feed Americans that these plumes lingering behind aircraft and crisscrossing the sky for hours are condensation trails is not only disingenuous, but completely unscientific.
Now, when that hot air exits the tailpipe, this occurs, the contrails, not the chemical, the contrails occur because of cold air, minus 30. It takes a high altitude, around 30,000 feet plus, and that air turns to, there's carbon dioxide and water vapor in that exhaust. That turns to ice crystals, and that's what you see, the white stream behind it. those white crystals of ice warm up, dissolve, and the smoke goes away. And it never lasts more than a minute. Usually it's in seconds, depending outside air conditions. What we're seeing now, and I first could not believe it, and I started looking at the skies, and these are not normal. They're not natural. There's something going on. I don't know who it is or why they're doing it. All I can testify is it's not natural and it's not normal. It's got to be some outside influence doing that.
Trails, if they are true condensation trails, will completely dissipate within 15 seconds. A statement issued by the United States Air Force that contrails become visible roughly about a wingspan behind an aircraft. A Boeing 757 has a wingspan of about 125 feet. That means behind the engines of that aircraft, you will see a chemtrail of 125 feet that will quickly dissipate. Evergreen Aviation admits the weather modification spraying. I got a patent number here. They call them chem bombs. Got a beautiful picture that you can go online and find. Tons of aerosol can be released in a line up to 250 miles or in huge clusters. That's when you see the interruptions in the sky of batches of artificial cirrus clouds. However, behind an aerosol spraying aircraft, they stream, persist, and according to the winds aloft, will dissipate only after hours of lingering because the chemicals are falling out of the sky onto the planet.
Because there's so many of them. When you look up at the sun and you see a white haze, that is aluminum floating in the air right now, and it's coming from the aircraft.
As outlandish as all of this might seem, it wouldn't be the first time the U.S. government has experimented with secret chemicals over its citizens. In St. Louis during the Cold War, the government sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide over an unsuspecting inner-city neighborhood as part of a biological weapons test. Then, as part of Operation Red Hat, the United States' own military was exposed to various toxins and nerve agents. Then there was Operation Delirium.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. In secret experiments during the Cold War, the U.S. Army tested nerve gas, hallucinogenics, and other chemicals on its own soldiers to see if these chemicals could be used during wartime to incapacitate the enemy.
How can so many claim that governments and militaries around the world would not spray chemical and biological agents on populations when there are literally hundreds of historically documented cases of such operations occurring in recent decades? Many biological warfare experiments were officially used to test the range and dispersal patterns of aerosol, particulates, and biological agents. In the United States alone, by 1977, 239 open-air biological tests had been conducted over unknowing U.S. populations. Tests were conducted throughout the 20th century, many of which took place concurrently with the covert ramp-up of climate engineering operations.
According to the World Meteorological Organization, there's 50 countries already using weather-modifying technology. Understanding the devastating human and environmental impacts, governments around the world have begun issuing bans and moratoriums on geoengineering.
2024 New Hampshire bill will attempt to ban climate engineering operations. House Bill 1700-FN as introduced 2024 session. Here are excerpts. The Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Services shall immediately issue a cease and desist order upon the discovery of stratospheric aerosol injection, cloud seeding, weather modification, or other atmospheric polluting activity, including excessive electromagnetic radio frequency microwave radiation emissions. The General Court finds that many atmospheric activities such as weather modification, stratospheric aerosol injection, solar radiation modification, and other forms of geoengineering involving the intentional release of polluting emissions harm human health, state security, and the economy of New Hampshire.
This legislation simply amends, adds a new section of the Tennessee Air Quality Act prohibiting the intentional injection, release, or dispersion of chemicals, chemical compounds, substances, or apparatus into the atmosphere within the borders of our state for the express purpose of affecting temperature, weather, or the intensity of solar radiation. Growing up, I would have never thought I'd had to come to y'all with a request to pass a law for this, but that is the world we live in.